Oh, there you are. Come in now, dears.
Ready, and... Na, 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 na. Na, 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 na. Need somebody to help me say it.
This is the story of 100 years of British dancing, from the Lambeth Walk to raving in a field off the M25. It spans immigration, legislation, self-expression, 2 wars, economic flux, and a panoply of unsuitable shoes. The British might not define themselves as a nation of dancers, not like the Americans with their jitterbug or the Cubans with their mambo. But we did give the world ballroom dancing. And we do like a bop on the quiet.
You know I feel all right.
Every social change has affected how and where we dance.
Na, 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 na. Na, 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 na.
They all made their mark on the dance floor. Because the dance floor is where we come together with nothing to do but have fun, it's the first place we notice we're changing. Because dance is how we say things before we even know we think them. Because how the British danced, where they danced, and who they danced with, is, in many cases, the history of Britain. This is one of the earliest recordings of British dance, children dancing to a street piano in 1899. In many ways, portable sound system, dancing in the street, it's an early rave. But unlike their fortunate great-great-grandchildren, these children were born into a world that would experience huge economic, political, sexual and social upheaval. Between 1900 and 1945, Britain experienced 2 world wars separated by severe economic depression. It was a cruel introduction to the modern world. But despite, or perhaps because of the hardship and fear, people still found time to dance. During these 45 years, Britain invented the rules of ballroom dancing, struggled to keep our maypoles erect, and started a love affair with American dance music that continues today. At the start of the century, how and where you danced depended on that most British of things, class.
If you were a member of the upper class, society as it was known, then during the London season you could be dancing 3 or 4 times a night at a ball. So the people who had the most opportunity to dance were the upper classes, not the working classes, because they were working so hard, and also it costs money if you wanted to enter a hall.
These class divisions were changed, along with so much else, by the First World War.
There was a general loss of trust, if you like, in English culture, British culture as a whole. The office class had a lot of stick for the decisions that they'd taken, and the kinds of culture that they followed became less popular because of that. People were more willing to accept the vigorous new dance music from the other side of the Atlantic because of what they'd been through.
This vigorous new music was American ragtime and jazz, a sound from a fresh new continent that had not just been blown apart by a huge war. The post-war years saw a massive shift in the position of women. Thanks to the suffragettes campaign, women over 30 got the vote in 1918. Empowered by their wartime work in factories, women were loath to return to their previous jobs in menial domestic service. While the upper classes moaned about the difficulty of recruiting a good undermaid, working-class women finally had the time and a bit of money for leisure, including dancing. Except there weren't that many dance venues until the first great movement of 20th century British dancing started, the era of the dance hall.
The first Palais de Danse in Britain opened in 1919, 28th of October 1919, the Hammersmith Palais in London. And if you'd have walked in, instantly you would have been struck by the sheer glamour of the place. From the moment you walk through the door, you're entering a sort of fantasy land. You're greeted by uniformed attendants, there are smart waiters and waitresses, lavish decorations, and there's a real air of sophistication and sense of luxury.
They were sort of dream palaces. And a lot of the people, perhaps working class people, going to these dance halls lived really rather limited lives in, you know, small spaces. And all of a sudden, here they were in this glitzy sort of aircraft hangar with a perfectly sprung floor, which made it lovely to dance on. And there were sometimes coloured fountains, and there were lights, and there were streamers. And it must have just seemed like stepping into a film set in which you were sort of part of the action.
If you could squeeze onto the Palais dance floor with the other 2,000 dancers, you could waltz and foxtrot all night for the price of a cheap ticket. Women of all classes in the 20s were marrying later in life, so they had more dancing and flirting years before settling down. The new Palais became the perfect backdrop for boy meets girl.
I think dance halls particularly appealed to younger women. I mean, after all, if you went to the cinema, you didn't really talk to people, whereas if you went to the dance hall, they were sociable places, and frankly, they were places to, you know, for romance.
One feature of the larger dance halls was paid dancers, men and women who were paid by the management to dance with single people, obviously to get people who didn't have a dance partner to come dancing. They were usually kept in distinct areas of the dance hall, almost in a pen, if you like. And they were considered to be a little bit immoral.
The famous British dancer and bandleader Victor Sylvester began his career as a paid partner.
They had the boys in a pen on one side and the girls in a pen on the other, and people used to hire them out at 6pence a dance.
Most people considered the women to be prostitutes and the men to be gigolos.
I know my father, who was a clergyman, he was the vicar of Wembley, and he was terribly shocked when he heard about this, that he should have a son who was a gigolo. When I made a success of it, then, of course, he looked on it quite differently.
In the end, it didn't matter who was dancing, who was asking, and who was paying. The dance halls were a phenomenon. 3 million people went to Hammersmith Palais in its first decade. But what really turned the whole nation dance crazy was greater access to music.
In the early 1920s, if you want music, it's live. But then the gramophone starts to have an impact, and by the later 1920s, people begin to start listening to the radio, and by the 30s, you have a culture in common simply because of that, the way in which the BBC could broadcast tea dances from the Savoy, and everybody around the world could share it.
National programme from London. Now you're going to hear the first performance of the new BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall.
It's just the time for dancing. Tomorrow is today. Go where the music's calling and dance the blues away.
Certainly dancing seems to be everywhere. It's ubiquitous. There are songs about dancing, there are films about dancing, there are articles in newspapers about dancing and dancers.
And the dancing was driven by the music, not the melody, but the rhythm. It was all about syncopation, the beat that hits you twice.
Imagine you've got a beat going along, and you've got a tune that really sticks with that. Da, dee, da, da. If you've got syncopation, you start to move and put the emphasis in between those beats. Da, 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 da. And so the emphasis coincides less with the beat. I think syncopation makes you want to dance, basically. It's that sort of compulsive element in the music. Sometimes it makes us want to emphasise the beat with our feet, to reinforce that beat for ourselves. But sometimes it can actually lead us to be maybe more free and more improvisatory in our dance and in our response to the music.
This flurry of elbows, knees and hands washing invisible windows is the Charleston. It was the jazz dance of the 1920s, and like drunken hen parties now, everyone just had to have a go at it.
Everybody knows the Charleston. It's a fairly simple step. Forward, back, back, forward. Forward, back, back, forward. It can be danced here. Or the upright Charleston. Scarecrow. Aeroplane, propeller. And of course, what's become known as Granny's kneecaps. In this dance, people had the freedom to express themselves. They weren't so rigid as when they were dancing in a couple. They could break away from their partner, and not everybody had to do it the same way.
The origins of the Charleston are slightly mysterious, but it was certainly a black American dance, probably from Charleston, South Carolina, and with its roots in African dance.
I think it's not too far-fetched to say that every development in Western social dance has been taken from black people, whether it's people from Africa, the Caribbean, or from North America. Every dance form you can think, from the black bottom, the Charleston, started off with African Americans, was taken over by white people. It's completely different to the things that white people are doing. They see it as something fun, they can let go, they can twist their hips, they can twist their legs, they can bend their arms. It's none of the formal upright dancing that they would have been used to.
But whilst these new dances were cutting across racial and class divides, they weren't cutting across generations. Dance became the pursuit of the young. This is where a generation gap opened up on the dance floor.
You're not going to find many people in their 60s or 70s doing the black bottom or the Charleston. It's the bright young things who were very into their partying, exactly the same as young people now into their partying, with the full sense that that means that they were taking large amounts of alcohol, they were doing large amounts of drugs, and they were basically having a good time after the horrors of the First World War.
Young people, a new fast beat, and drugs, classic triggers for moral outrage. 30 years later, it's rock and roll. 30 years after that, acid house. But back in the 20s, it's jazz dance which causes moral panic.
Why is dancing considered to be so bad?
Dance, dance, dance to the lady youth, it's fleeting to the rhythm beat.
There are a number of reasons for this. The dance craze is associated with a lot of social changes that are going on, particularly women's roles and their perceived new independence in post-war Britain. Then it's associated with flappers and a sort of decadent hedonism. There's a connection that's long-standing between dancing and sin. It's always been assumed that dancing and sin go hand in hand, that somehow dances are an expression of lustful passions, and that many of the new jazz dances, and particularly the freakish steps of the jazz dances, are considered to be expressions of, sexual energy.
My blood boils with the tropic heat, and the rhythm of my heart is tom-tom beat. You bring out the savage in me. Primitive love cries reach my ears with the passion of 100 million years.
So this immorality, the immoral sense of dancing, is particularly strong.
Oh, call it madness or sin. How was I to know what was sleeping within me?
Now, when you connect that with the fact that it's American, and there's a great deal of concern about the Americanization of British culture at this time and the growing power of America. But also there's a racist reaction because jazz and these new dances are associated with black culture. And black culture is considered to be not only inferior, but it's not benign. It's actually dangerous. It has some sort of way of paralyzing people's sense of what's right and what's wrong. So for all these reasons, the jazz dances, the new dances, create a moral panic.
And what makes it all so much worse is that it's the working classes who are the driving force. Not just in popular culture, in politics too. In 1924, Ramsay MacDonald became Prime Minister of the first ever Labour government. The establishment wasn't waving its hat in the air.
People outside the working class are a little bit terrified, and they think of almost any kind of mass culture, especially if they're not used to it, if it's not, you know, classical music or theatre or whatever. If it's a variation on that, they're a bit frightened by it because they think something else is taken over, and it may be the first signs of Bolshevism in Britain, and they're a little bit frightened.
Too late. Terrifying portents of Soviet tendencies had already been spotted on the dance floors of Britain. Philip Richardson, the editor of the Dancing Times, seen here handing out a trophy, was worried.
Richardson spoke about dance Bolshevism, which implies that the kind of anarchy that was happening on the dance floor in the 1920s, when there was no steps anymore, was almost the equivalent of what had happened in Russia, the Russian Revolution, and that had to be contained.
People were responding to the beat, and they were doing things which were antisocial in the ballroom. One of which was using your arms like the village pump. As you were dancing, you were walking and you were jerking, and of course you could whack somebody with your arm. And also people would do a thing called the dip, which meant that they would suddenly be walking along doing this ragtime one step, which is just one step to each beat of the bar, and they would suddenly dip down. And of course, that takes longer, so the person behind you will probably bash into you. And so there were lots of sort of antisocial movements, as well as this idea that people were dancing too close.
The potential for civil disobedience was clearly growing. In the absence of a government intervention, a conference of British dance teachers decided to quick step in. And so, in 1926, they laid down the rules for the waltz, the tango, the foxtrot and the quick-step. From now on, it was very strictly ballroom. The oldest of the new ballroom canon was the waltz. It originated in Vienna in the 1700s. It was introduced to England in 1816 and first danced by the Prince Regent. This rotating partnered dance in the closed position outraged the contemporary press.
The Times newspaper warned mothers not to allow their daughters to do this dancing with the voluptuous entwining of limbs.
Of course, with that kind of press, the waltz became an instant success with those daughters. Voluptuous entwining would be the British style of dancing for the next 150 years.
The waltz is a soft and musical dance. It's very much a swinging dance. It's like a pendulum. It's not just 1, 2, 3. It's 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
That's where your pendulum swing comes. If you imagine a pendulum of a large clock swinging, and as it gets to the top of the swing, it stops and then it swings back again. That's a waltz.
The foxtrot is named after its American inventor, Harry Fox, a vaudeville actor. It was first performed in New York in 1914. The foxtrot gave the world the phrase slow, slow, quick, quick, slow, although there's not much slow to see here in the 1920s. Eventually, the dance evolved into something more elegant and much harder to do.
The connoisseur's dance, and that is the slow foxtrot. It is elegant, head up, the girl with her back straight, the shoulders level, the elbows level, the legs passing each other all the time because there's very little sideways movement.
The foxtrot is a linear dance. You lower into the floor and you move, and you turn and you move in a straight line.
It's rather like a big cat, the foxtrot. Rather like a jaguar or a leopard. You know, it's definitely the feet go into the ground, and it's a whoosh feeling, and it never stops.
The third dance to be standardised was the quick step. It's a perky little number, half hop skip of the Charleston, half the rhythm of the fast foxtrot.
The character of the quick step comes from the slows, not the quicks. If you dance it all quicks, there's no character to the dance. It's all a sort of race round the floor. It's light, effervescent, it's very energetic, very strenuous, and the modern choreography is very complicated.
There goes my baby with someone new. She sure looked happy and I'm so blue.
It's a classic British compromise. The energy of syncopation without the anarchy of jazz. A way to let off steam without involving the hips or anything unseemly. If the waltz and the foxtrot are romantic and the quick-step is a bit of slap and tickle, then the tango is far more serious. A grand passion, a clandestine affair, the woman you need to keep hidden from your wife. And just like the waltz before it, the British public were introduced to this sensual foreign pastime by the globe-trotting royal family.
The person who is really at the centre of the story, I think, seems to be the Prince of Wales, because at that time he was travelling a lot to Argentina. He was a big dancer anyway, and he picked up the tango when he was there and brought it back to England. But at the same time, there's a dance band leader called Geraldo who was very interested in Latin American music, and he travelled a lot. So he came back from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, obsessed with the kind of gaucho look, gets the neckerchief and puts all his band into this outfits and brings the tango back. And of course, the Prince of Wales goes to the Savoy and dances tango, and once the Prince of Wales has done it, everybody wants to do it. Tango is a very cool sort of dance in a way. It's not like the Cuban dances or the Brazilian dances. So in a way it would suit the British, especially at that time when it was a very kind of stiff society. It's very formulaic and it's very complex.
There is no rise and fall in tango. It's walks, and those walks can be quite stealthy and they can be quite sexy because it has no frivolous side to it at all. It is deadly serious.
The essence of a tango is movement and stillness. It's a staccato dance. It's described as a dance of passion. If someone moves very suddenly and they stop, then that's tango.
Waiting for the day.
So, to the relief of the British desire to invent rules, move in an orderly manner and look unruffled at all times, British dance became standardised. Now everyone knew that they were doing the right dance in the right way. This right way became known as the English style.
What came out of it, the wonderful English style of ballroom dancing for which this country is famous and which we've imported all over the world, was based very much on it being refined and elegant, an upright posture, a calm exterior, and the sense of being perfectly poised, being very smooth, no sudden extreme movements. And it accords very much with the notion of the English gentleman. And it's a style of dancing that you see in Fred Astaire, who sort of in a way epitomises this idea of cool nonchalance.
The English style is seen as a sort of bulwark against Americanisation. There's little room for self-expression. And in this sense, this is why it's English. It's supposed to conform to middle-class notions of sobriety and stoicism, in sharp contrast to the emotional, energetic dances that had gone before it.
This, however, was the story of British dance in the cities. In the country, they did things differently. Dancing round a maypole, skipping about holding ribbons, what could be more British than that? But like a lot of our folk heritage, its origins are both more confused and more recent than we might think. And at times, far more ridiculous. The tradition of dancing round a decorated pole or tree dates back to the 16th century. The ribbons, however, are neither ancient nor British.
It seems that the ribbons attached to the maypole are a continental import in the late 19th century.
That was a popular Victorian pastime, reinventing British history.
People would look back to Shakespeare, and of course in Shakespeare you have Morris dancing, you have May Days, and there was a whole interest in the late Victorian period for looking back to the days of Merry England, of Good Queen Bess.
This cheerful Victorian nostalgia for Merry England turned into Edwardian concern over waning folk traditions. Popular folk culture was already turning into a kind of early mashup. The May Day parade in Bootle 1905 shows Morris men next to suffragettes demanding the vote, followed by blacked-up music hall minstrels.
People were beginning to realise that we really were an industrialised country. There was a great concern, almost a panic, that society was heading towards degradation because, of course, democracy meant that the greater numbers of the urban working class who were classed or seen as degenerate physically, morally, mentally, were likely to take over.
It was all very well having Negro jazz music in the cities. Everyone was going to hell in a handcart anyway. But country song and dance had to be protected from pernicious modern influences like ragtime, shorter skirts, and unionisation.
I think it was a middle-class panic about the loss of the rural, about the loss of contact with the countryside. People begin to think that there's something disappearing, that there's something which is being squeezed out by the new imports of new music, then by the radio. And so there was a real fear in the early 1900s, then again in the 20s and then in the 30s, that this culture was going to be destroyed, and you therefore had to record it, had to preserve it.
The self-appointed leader of the folk preservation drive was Cecil Sharp, seen here in the light-coloured suit, busting some moves on a lawn. Sharp was a composer and musician, but not, perhaps, a natural dancer.
A man of 57 with gout, taking up the teaching of dance. It does seem a bit unlikely, but he was taken with what the dance meant in terms of folklore.
Sharp was inspired, obsessed even, by the idea that a revival of folk culture could return England to purer, gentler times.
He actually saw folk dance as the means of this cultural regeneration, the big national revival that he was looking for.
In 1911, Sharp formed the English Folk Dance Society, whose headquarters still exist in London today. Over the next decade, Sharp and other society members went out, notebooks in hand, in search of England's traditional dances. They were tweedy, well-meaning types, knocking on the doors of labourers' cottages and asking them to dance. The researchers would then notate and learn the steps so they could teach them to others.
A lot of the communities that Cecil Sharp visited had, within the recent past, lost their traditions of Morris dancing. And so very often he was doing a sort of archaeological rescue job almost, for which he made no apology, because he was convinced that he was collecting the true ethnic inheritance of England.
Sharp didn't concentrate on Scottish or Welsh dancing, as the problem was perceived to be more urgent in England.
There wasn't the same sense that a big urban culture was driving out rural Welsh or Scottish culture, and in England there was seen to be that threat, and there was also much more concern than there was in Scotland about the English working class rejecting folk culture and folk dancing in favour of other things.
By 1914, Cecil Sharp had collected hundreds of Morris, country and sword dances. Many of these survive today, but they may have been lost if it weren't for his crusading efforts. To the collectors, these dances were all about myth and meaning. They were not an enjoyable prelude to a tumble in the hay. They were living history, a line back to our ancient pagan past. Except they weren't.
At the time that Sharp was collecting, the dances were seen as survivals of ancient rituals, of ancient religion, of rites that were central to the meaning of English culture, national culture.
People say that it's to do with stamping fertility into the ground, it's to do with scaring off the evil spirits. So all these, you know, the hankies, the bells, the noise, it's all got a reason. Everyone wants this stuff to go back to some primitive beginning, some pre-Christian period. And yet we have no evidence at all. The earliest evidence of Morris dancing in church wardens' accounts is the 15th century, which is hardly the Dark Ages.
Back in 1910, however, it was this apparent pagan history that made Cecil Sharp cherish the Morris men above all others. As far as he was concerned, if a dance didn't have any ancient symbolism, if it was just about getting down, it didn't go in his book.
Sharp had a very distinctive idea of what folk was, and that did not include, in the main, urban styles of dancing.
So step and clog dancers, the ancestors of Michael Flatley, got left out. These dances were too popular, too cityfied, and too meaninglessly enjoyable to be included.
It was done competitively, and it was very, very commercial. And again, that was another aspect of it that was not acceptable. And then, of course, association with the music hall, association with money, association with prizes, almost entirely working class. And so it didn't get collected in the same way that the processional Morris dances weren't collected, particularly the Lancashire ones. Nobody celebrated the fact that people from the Northwest, for example, had kept this lovely aspect of culture going over years and years and years, taking it with them when they moved into town to work in factories. That wasn't seen as a matter of celebration. It wasn't rural, and therefore it wasn't as good.
Sometimes community dances didn't fit into a straightforward category, like the furry dance in Helston, Cornwall, which is still danced every year.
Dances that expressed community are so interesting and so important. Things like the Helston dance, where everybody in the village can be involved in your best clothes, because it's an important day for the village, and you dance in and out of houses, and it's a really significant day. Something that marks the community out and gives it an identity. In terms of what makes traditions continue, then that sense of identity and people being involved in it is what makes the difference. What Sharp did with the revival was to cut those roots away and say this is national, in a way that it wasn't really, and it belonged to everybody, in which case it belongs to nobody, really.
However, some dancers knew full well who owned their local dance. They did.
Having somebody turn up and collect your dance wasn't always popular. People like the Bake-Up coconut dancers actually wrote out a contract about who could do their dance. They were experienced trade unionists and they knew how to protect their property. Other people who were less well organised refused to let Sharp notate the dance, and then he'd pay somebody to tell him about it. And it was, in some places, still talked of as a kind of betrayal of the local dancers, even into the 1950s and 60s.
Sharp's legacy was selective but powerful. His vision of England, perfect villages, maypoles and Morris dancing, is to some extent still our vision of England. We define ourselves with it. We react against it. And chances are, if you learned country dancing at school and clutched the unwilling hand of a fellow 8-year-old while squeaking your plimsolls across the assembly room floor, you have Cecil Sharp to thank. The folk revival was a huge success with the rattled post-war middle classes of the 1920s, but it didn't seem to fit with the mood of the new decade.
The 1930s sees the move away from the kind of rural idyll of Englishness. Tradition ceased to be popular. What must have seemed like prancing about in public in very prissy ways was just not... well, it wasn't new, it wasn't different, it wasn't cutting edge anymore. It certainly wasn't cool.
There may be trouble ahead.
In the history books, the 1930s have little to recommend them. They started with a worldwide economic crash in 1929, continued with endemic unemployment and the rise of European fascism, and ended with the outbreak of the Second World War. A war, it seemed at the time, almost impossible for Britain to win. But despite this grim outlook, everyday life continued.
It's too easy for us to think about the 1930s in terms of the shadow of war looming over everybody, but actually a lot of people were having a very good time. There was a lot more Americanized dance music around and people were dancing to it.
And if you did take to the floor, chances were you'd be dancing to Victor Sylvester's musical arrangements. In the 1930s, Sylvester was the king of the ballroom. Or rather, it's Sergeant Major. He made sure everyone was dancing to the same rhythm by creating strict tempo dance music.
Victor Sylvester was salvation to the dancing profession. The secret really was consistency, was to start on a certain beat and keep that going to the end of the dance, giving the dancer the chance to dance consistently to that beat. So that is why we all loved Victor Sylvester to death.
Consistency and technique were watchwords of 30s dancing, the decade where ballroom competitions really took off in Britain.
Popular Music and Dancing Weekly does a survey of standards of dancing in Britain in 1934 and notes how Mr. and Miss 1934 want to get it right. They're not content with just shuffling around the ballroom.
And now for a demonstration of dancing, arranged by those famous exponents from the Empress Rooms, Kensington, Phyllis Hayler, former world champion, and Charles Scrimshaw. The others in the picture are also well-known expert dancers. But for your special benefit, they're pretending they're just ordinary folk, making just ordinary mistakes, like this wrong position of the arm.
Things are much more serious in the dance hall. The emphasis is not on having fun, but on getting things right.
Miss Hayler thinks the style of the gentleman is much too boisterous. It's bad form to rush about the room, and his partner should keep her hips forward and lean back from the waist. And now what's wrong here? Well, of course, the lady's frock is too tight and hampers her movements, and the gentleman can't take long steps. Miss Hayler indicates the flowing frock of her sister Frida as being a more suitable type.
Now, there are two forms here. You must use your heels when you go forward, Teddy. Slide your foot forward on the heel. And Frida, keep your feet quite straight. Keep them in. Don't turn your toes up like that. Will you try that now?
Two of the party have just come back from America, so here's a swing step, hot from Harlem. But it's rather too hot for English ballrooms. So let's try a swing step that's a little quieter. Good.
That looks rather nice. Shall we all try it?
No surprise then that this emphasis on perfectionism was putting off non-competitive dancers and women whose dresses were not of the flowing type. Someone somewhere needed to make British dance more stupid again. And that man was Karl Heinemann, the boss of the Mecca chain of dance halls.
Hyman is a ruthless businessman and he wants to get as many people through the doors as possible. And the way he does this is by creating a number of new dances. And he had two things that he wanted to achieve. It had to be easy and it had to be a group dance. He starts off with the Palais Glide in 1935 and essentially Hyman puts the fun back in the dance hall.
Still a favourite community dance is the Palais Glide, with its hop, skip and jumpy tune. If everyone isn't quite in step, what's a little step out of step among newfound friends?
That was the Palais Glide, little more than jigging around in the manner of an aunt at a wedding, but revolutionary at the time.
You can get really pally in the Palais Glide. It's just one big happy family enjoying a glide and a jump. The jump may be a little late sometimes, but better late than never. Now they're putting their backs into it, to say nothing of lots of encircled waists. Yes, indeed, many a romance has started with a glide. The key changes. Very soon the tempo will change too. It'll be faster and faster. The gliders are being warmed up for the crash landing.
In the Palais Glide, people got in a line, about 8, arms around one another, and did a little kick dance and marched forward and went back. You know, very simple, but they all did the same thing. The whole room's doing the same thing.
And there they go. The glide is becoming a gallop, but that's all part of the fun. It's a romp to the finish.
It was very popular, particularly for people that couldn't really dance well, you see. That was their big moment.
The Lambeth Walk was performed by the comedian Lupino Lane in the 1938 musical Me and My Gal. Karl Heinemann loved the song and saw that anyone who could tell their left foot from their right foot could manage the dance.
It's essentially a simple walking movement with an exaggerated swagger. and it involves people linking arms with their partners and ending with the refrain, doing the Lambeth Walk, oi. Through the Mecca network, they push it hard. And in fact, they go beyond the Mecca network and demonstrate the steps in any dance hall that wants to have them.
In terms of class, I suppose the Lambeth Walk gives the suggestion that actually it's the working class where fun's at, if you like. Working class dances are much more fun than doing the foxtrot or the quick step or the waltz.
It was actually building on a pre-existing music hall stereotype of working class people in London. And in a sense, this may explain its popularity with the middle and upper classes who, lap it up. They love it.
Well, America has imported the Lambeth Walk. London has sent a dance to New York.
The Lambeth Walk was Britain's only dance export to America in the first half of the century. It started a huge craze for other novelty dances, including Knees Up Mother Brown.
Knees up Mother Brown, well, knees up Mother Brown. Come along, dearie, let it go. E-I-E-I-E-I-O. It's your blooming birthday, let's wake up all the town. So knees up, don't get a breeze up, knees up Mother Brown.
It was like going to an organised party. And it was this idea, I think, about organised leisure, which was so typical of the 30s in a sense.
Britain needed all its organisation, stoicism and joy in the small things in life, when in September 1939, war was declared against Germany. Newsreels showed dancers putting on their tin hats and simply carrying on.
New dances in the tradition of the Lambeth Walk continue to reach the ballroom. The latest is an animated accompaniment to the Siegfried Line song. The washing hangs out on the line as the steel-helmeted dancers step it up.
After all, who would want to miss the chance of a song, a cigarette or a dance when anything and everything you held dear might just have disappeared by the morning?
If you were in the forces during the Second World War, you might have a very short leave time. You might get a 24-hour leave, 48-hour leave, so you would want to go out and have fun. You're living intensely. I mean, after all, you might be posted abroad, you might be killed, you might be in an air raid, so you would want to go out and have as intense a time as you could and meet somebody new and maybe have a flirt and maybe form a new relationship. So what better place to do it than the dance hall? And so the popularity of dance halls increased hugely during the Second World War. You had the blackout outside, you had shortages, you had rationing, and for 2 hours you could just lose yourself.
The latest dance is the blackout stroll, and here it is demonstrated by experts before the rank and file take it up. In a minute you'll see the point. The main idea is to change partners during the blackout. Practically anything might happen.
The home front was very much the battle front too, and in fact until 1942 more people are being killed on the home front than are being killed in the battlefield. So there was this intensive feeling, this feeling that you had to grasp pleasure for today, for tomorrow we might die.
When you're 17, you don't let trivialities like people like Hitler and wars get in your way. I mean, you've got your life to lead. I still went dancing.
Half of Europe was dislocated, bombed out or on the move. In Britain, 3 million men were in the forces, and many women were deployed in war work in munitions factories or on farms, billeted with strangers. Dance halls were where you went after work to find friends, to find life. It was where you could have a whole adventure in just one evening, just in one room with your best dress on.
Girls who up to then would have been expected to live at home until they're married were suddenly living in hostels with a lot of other young people.
Mary and I got drafted to the same aircraft factory. We were going to do work of national importance.
There was loads of girls brought in from all over the country to work in the factories, so there was a surplus of women, and they used to be in these hostels where you'd literally get 800 people. You'd get 600 sparkling girls and 200 very tired fellows, And we used to go into these spaces and dance.
whole social attitudes, their whole social mores, the whole ways they spent their leisure was completely different. And of course that's why so many, I think, older women now look back on their wartime as really golden years. You know, they were years of freedom and enjoyment, obviously with all the horrors of war hanging over them all the time. But there were these moments of, you know, sheer uninhibited pleasure, which hadn't existed in the same way before and possibly didn't exist in the same way for a long time afterwards.
As if going to a dance hall weren't exciting enough, in 1941 the GIs arrived from America.
Fraternization was the order of the day, and it certainly looks as if everything was going according to plan.
Along with the legendary gum, nylons and teeth, they brought with them their own bands, radio stations and high-energy style of dancing. It was these dancers who really taught the British how to swing. And the single biggest transformation of British dance came with the jitterbug, fresh out of Harlem.
The jitterbug was known in Britain, but most people didn't know how to do it, and of course that's what the Americans did. And the jitterbug and the Lindy Hop are really sort of forms of jive. I mean, again, they're dance based on black dancing.
Lindy Hop and Jitterbug are pretty much the same dance, although the Jitterbug was probably made a little bit easier for the masses to be able to do it. The basic step, it's step, step, triple step, 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 triple step. Sometimes when that's danced really fast, you can't actually see those steps happening. It looks just like lots of kicks. When you've got two partners, they're changing places and then coming back around to where they started. There was a shocking aspect to the Lindy Hop and the Jitterbug because there were lifts, there were these aerials, and suddenly girls were thrown into the air, revealing their legs and, shock horror, their underwear. And so there were ballrooms where it was banned, it was considered too shocking, it was morally irresponsible, and it was mimicking these black dancers, and so it was not considered the right thing for young people in England to do.
Although the jitterbug of 1940 had been frowned on as being disreputable and banned in ballrooms, when you had an invasion of I don't know how many 100,000 Americans all chasing the girls and everything, I'm afraid the ballrooms wilted, and a rather milder form of jitterbug, which got the name of jive, was taken in, and eventually the very pompous British Dance Council accepted it as something respectable rather than disreputable.
However pleased the British women were to see the American GIs, the fact was that the Americans didn't really want to be here fighting a European war. Aware of this discontent, the American government laid on endless entertainment for their GIs, such as dances at their bases to let them meet their most fervent admirers.
I think for most young English women, the arrival of the GIs seemed like manna from heaven. The idea of trying to get a Yank became very high on a lot of girls' priorities because, after all, they were very much better dressed than the English. They were better off. I mean, a American private would be paid something like 4 times what a British Tommy was paid, so of course that helped. And it often seemed to me that the dance hall was a particular kind of exemplar of Anglo-American tensions, really, at this time.
Can't look anywhere to see us. Hope they don't think I'm here to be picked up.
You'd have a row of girls and a British Tommy would come up and ask them to dance. They'd be looking over his shoulder, hoping there was a Yank behind.
Cheek. What does he think I am? Give me a chance.
Well, of course, this put the British Tommy's nose very much out of joint.
Perhaps I ought to stop. Or would it look silly? Might seem a bit stuck up. There's no harm, really. But I like the way he smiles. Englishmen can't dance like this. It's not just to put an arm around a girl either. He really likes it.
The British soldier didn't seem to be making it with the girls in the same way. He didn't know the dances. And you tried dancing in khaki battle dress and hobnail boots.
Fraternization on the dance floor and off it. See what I mean?
This sort of thing certainly caused punch-ups and resentment, and there was very real resentment. And of course resentment was serious, because the whole point of the GIs coming over was it was going to be an Allied attack on Fortress Europe. So it was very important that the American and British troops actually got on together because they were going to fight together.
To add to the tension, the American army in Britain was still a segregated army. Even in their leisure hours, black and white GIs remained strictly separate. White GIs in one town, blacks in another. They would go to different pubs, different cinemas, and different dances.
Mixing was very much discouraged. Black GIs were free to go to village dances and that sort of thing, but there was a great deal of resentment by white Americans when they danced with white British girls.
Oh, here I am.
In fact, the black GIs were pleasantly surprised by the warm welcome from the white British population, because they were used to more prejudice back home.
Goodbye. It's been very nice meeting you both.
Glad to have met you, I'm sure.
Funny you should come from Birmingham, too, isn't it? Have you come to my Birmingham, you must come to my home and have a cup of tea with me, both of you.
Thank you, we will.
Goodbye and good luck.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Most of them came from the South. They hadn't partaken in the American dream. They were much less scornful of Britain and British backwardness, and so a lot of the girls actually rather preferred the black GIs. They thought they were nicer people.
Now, look, men, you heard that conversation. That's not unusual here. It's the sort of thing that happens quite a lot. Now, let's be frank about it. There are colored soldiers as well as white here, and there are less social restrictions in this country.
There were lots of girls who excelled at jitterbug, and they found these boys very good at it, and in dancing you danced together. It didn't matter whether you were green or blue or black or white.
Sometimes there would be fights. Sometimes an English girl who danced with a black GI would find she was put on a blacklist, that she wouldn't be invited to a white dance, or no white officer would dance with her because she'd been contaminated by dancing with a black.
On the most important day of the 20th century, however, VE Day, everyone danced together. Hoarded beer was brought from the cellar, strangers kissed in the street, parties went on past dawn. They were celebrating simply being alive after a war that had left most of Europe in ruins.
It's a wonderful moment. You get people in uniform and out, people of all ages, in the streets, linking arms, forming conga lines and falling about laughing, and just releasing the tension of 5 or 6 years, some of which have been utterly horrible, in a way that only that kind of joyous collective physical movement could possibly express.
As Britain picked itself out of the rubble of the Second World War and headed towards the 1950s, it was in a world where the old orders and certainties had been blown to pieces. Whilst it had taken war and desperation to finally teach Britain how to swing, it was the post-war years of consumerism and plenty that were to teach us how to rock and roll. From 1945 to 1970, it's the teenagers, perpetually hungry for new music and new dance, who take over the dance floors. Glamour and marabou leave the dance floor to be replaced with their more insistent cousin, sex. And immigrants from the old empire bring new rhythms to challenge British feet. Dancing is no longer about rules, propriety, or even elegance. It's more get down baby than knees up Mother Brown.
More of our dance season still to come tonight on BBC4. We've got Time Shift's look at the jitterbug craze next, followed by Brit flick Billy Elliot at 20 to 11, and an omnibus documentary about its star, Jamie Bell, at 25 past midnight. Stay tuned.
Do it.